Is it possible to be metabolically healthy and be obese? You've done some research in this area, so maybe can you start by defining that term, metabolically healthy obesity?
Yes, and it's a great term because it's such an awesome debate, and it's still, just for all the listeners, it's a huge question in the field still, right? It is not perfectly well defined in terms of our understanding of it. So when we talk about this concept of a healthy obesity phenotype, it's essentially, we know if you have obesity, right? It typically comes along with biomarkers that are associated with that, that are also associated with downstream risk of other diseases. We can think of elevated blood glucose, right? Your blood sugar, elevated triglycerides or cholesterol, essentially fat in the blood, right? And so you have these elevations of, nutrients in the blood, circulating free fatty acids as well, and those are associated with poor health outcomes. You could also look at vitals like blood pressure, heart rate, and you see trends in individuals with obesity where all those biomarkers are shifting towards an unhealthy phenotype, increasing risk for disease. But there's a subset of people with obesity that don't have those negative looking biomarkers.
Hmm.
They look similar to what a lean individuals look like. So they have obesity, they have this excess adiposity, all right? So physically, the difference is clear, difference in BMI, body weight, and all of that. But their blood sugar and their cholesterol and their blood pressure are all normal. And so that is sort of what was defined as a metabolically healthy obesity. So this phenotype where you have obesity, but you don't have that change in all those underlying biomarkers that we associate with cardiometabolic disease. And so that's kind of the difference there. And if you look through the literature, if you're doing reading on this, you will see that the majority of studies don't have a standardized definition for what they consider this metabolically healthy versus metabolically unhealthy obesity phenotype. So it becomes a little difficult to parse through the literature and pick stuff apart. But for the most part, people have been able to define these two groups of individuals using cutoffs of some sort.
Yeah, and you guys looked at almost 100 sedentary adults in that study, and can you walk us through that setup and what you guys found?
Yeah. Okay. So we did something very different, and this was such a cool study, and I think a really great addition to the metabolic, the the metabolically healthy obesity phenotype.
The
Sorry,
mouthful.
in house we abbreviated as MHO and MUO and all these
Yeah,
other things.
MHO is cool. We could.
But anyway, so this was actually a study spearheaded by Dr. Kristen Hadi, and she is a sleep metabolism nutrition researcher. She's also a registered dietitian, and she was interested to look at these two groups of individuals, right? These metabolically healthy and the metabolically unhealthy, and compare their metabolic health on a different, more intricate level. So, as I mentioned, the split is usually on these circulating blood biomarkers, right? And
Mhm.
usually, when you look at studies, they'll have thousands of people. You mentioned ours had 100, which is a good number, but it's nowhere near thousands and thousands of people, right?
Yeah.
The reason for that is because we did one extra measure that no one else in the literature has done on these individuals, and that was called the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. Whoa, crazy. I know. No one knows what that is. So essentially what it is, it's an intricate procedure which is the gold standard for
Yep.
measuring someone's insulin resistance, specifically the peripheral insulin resistance. We focus on the skeletal muscle. The reason to do that is it's really the primary physiologic defect that leads to downstream metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes. So to do this procedure, we lay people down in a hospital bed and we infuse essentially glucose and insulin into their bodies.
Yep.
And by doing that, we just get these really intricate measures of what their peripheral insulin sensitivity is. So, what we did in this study, and the only reason this was feasible is because Dr. John Kerwin, who is, boy, he has been a leader in the field of metabolism and nutrition for since the 80s. What is that? 3 decades now? going
Yeah,
into a
going
fourth
on
decade.
4. Yeah,
Right. So he's been doing phenomenal work since.
since aerobics was cool.
Yeah, yeah, seriously. So he came out of that Ball State lineage, which any of you that follow the exercise science world, that is like the realm to be in terms of exercise science physiology. And he's just done such awesome work, everything from glycogen and the skeletal muscle to the impact of diet on insulin resistance, and lots of work on whole grains and glycemic index. It's phenomenal. But one of the things he did is over the years, he did all these studies, and he made sure when he did these hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamps, his protocol was perfectly standardized. And so what that let us do is that let us take multiple studies that he did, combine that together, and then analyze these individuals with this metabolically healthy or unhealthy phenotype, and then look at deeper. What does it look like when we actually look at what I would call true insulin sensitivity is, right?
Yeah,
When you look at those clamp measured values. I mean, this is like an 8-hour procedure, right? You can't do this to normal people in a clinical setting. That's why it's so cool.
yeah,
So I guess you want to get
absolutely.
to like what did we find, right?
Exactly. Well, now you got
what did,
everybody on the edge of their seats. What were some of the key findings there?
the biggest one was that we could define these two groups. We had people that were different, that matched for obesity, but were different in terms of those circulating biomarkers. But when you look at their insulin sensitivity, they were exactly the same. And they were
Hmm.
both much poorer than an otherwise lean individual.
Wow.
So, yeah. And that was kind of the critical piece of the paper, was identifying that, okay, even though they're technically considered metabolically healthy by these circulating biomarkers, their underlying insulin sensitivity is still not good. And that is just that's big to know for your long-term progression of disease risk.
100%. I mean, it's it comes back to this question I was going to come to previously about the athletes and the retired athletes, because we see that typically retired NFL players, obviously you have a much lower risk. I think it's 45 or 46% lower risk of cardiovascular events. Then we get the subset of linemen that are 50+% increased risk. And to your point here, when I got a lot of clients who play football and rugby, and these guys, their profiles do look great when we look at their blood pressure and we look at triglyceride to HDL and some of these biomarkers. But the question is always, well, after retirement, this is where we get into trouble. And so on a couple fronts, the first is when we're looking at just what you described here, obviously weight loss is still going to be a key part of this whole story, no?
Yeah, for sure. And I love the example of the offensive and defensive linemen, or some of these other sports where you need a higher weight to be really competitive in it. Because one of the things that happens when they're still active athletes is their exercise is super high, right?
Yeah.
Like you're 3 hours a day sometimes, I mean, these guys are going.
And
And what
muscle
that
mass too,
does,
right?
oh yeah, I mean, just profound muscle mass, because they're working out all the time, they're keeping that, and it just creates this really protective environment so that they don't have those negative biomarkers. And I mean, you hit it right on the head, right? Okay, but then they have retirement. And so then all of a sudden you have this situation where you don't have that intensive exercise. And even if you adjust your diet, right? Even if you adjust your diet and you maintain your weight so you're not gaining too much weight, or maybe you even lose a little weight, that activity is just plummeted. And that's where you can get into this risky area where now maybe you're going to develop that more unhealthy phenotype. And the reason we believe that would happen is because of that underlying concern with just having that excess adiposity that Kristen Hottie and Dr. Kerwin and myself and others defined in that pretty recent, what was that, 2019 2020 maybe, I think it actually just came out, 2021 even. We've been working on it for a while now. I can't remember when we actually put it out there, but that's the core concept, right? So like the general thought, I think if you look at the leaders in the field on defining these healthy and unhealthy obesity phenotypes, the general thought is that the metabolically healthy obesity phenotype is transient and it's temporary. And you can only maintain that for so long if you have good activity, if you have a stellar diet, and if you're really doing everything for optimal health. And so once you lose something like activity, or once your diet shifts and maybe you have a lot more saturated fat, right, or added sugar, all of a sudden those other factors that are really potentially damaging long term tend to creep up.